So I'd like to introduce Tom Gibbs, who many of you know is one of our primary contacts with NVIDIA for the scientific research world. He's I think a bit in the middle and well connected to a lot of things that are going on in the sort of COVID-19 response. So we asked him to come to this meeting to give us his perspective and what he sees going on. And so with that, I'll pass to Tom.
Sure, thanks, Peter. I had a conversation with Mike Sokolov about a week or so ago now, and he had mentioned that you had put this group together. As many of you know, I've been working with the high energy physics community for a number of years now. And I've also worked with the computational chemistry and biology community as well, but I've probably spent most of my career more on the physics side of things. And today I brought with me somebody who actually understands computational chemistry and biology, because I figured you might have some questions about that, since that's the gist of the consortium. And his name is Abe Stern. And Abe, I'll just have you introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure. Abe Stern. I'm a data scientist at NVIDIA. My background is computational chemistry, where I did a lot of molecular dynamics and quantum electronic structure calculations. And at NVIDIA, I primarily focus at the intersection of AI methods applied to molecular dynamics and quantum chemistry. So I'm happy to contribute where I can.
Great. Thanks, Abe. Any technical questions about some of the details of the project? So I'm probably going to have to defer to you. So at the high level, I think most of you are aware of the Supercomputing Consortium. It was formed a few weeks ago out of the direction of the White House. It includes the Office of Science and Technology and DOE, NIH, and the National Science Foundation. Anyone globally can submit a proposal to use the supercomputing assets. I'll go through some of those here in a minute. And NVIDIA is a member of the consortium. We are not providing hardware resources directly, but we are providing technical expertise. And the team that I'm working with has gone out and directly engaged. We've reached out to all the teams, and we've directly engaged about 80% of them, and we have some ongoing meetings with a couple of more of those teams. And when I was talking to Mike, he indicated that you guys had put this this organization together with kind of some web tools for sharing, and then it might be interesting for me to give you a thumbnail of what we're seeing with that's interesting, with the program, and some observations about some of the projects. So with that, we'll launch in. So for those of you who aren't intimate with this, there are multiple sites. I've listed them here. So Oak Ridge, Lawrence Livermore, NERSC, TAC, SDSC, NCSA, PSC, NASA Ames, AWS, and Microsoft. There may be a couple of more. I didn't actually check this. So as this is being broadcast, if I left somebody off, it was just more of a typo than anything else. Needless to say, there is a lot of computing power as well as expertise at each of these sites to help the project teams. The project teams today are at 37. There are new ones that get submitted every day. Sometimes it's a few, a couple days sometimes go by without new ones coming in. Some of these projects had been using the supercomputer facilities before. Some of them are brand new to the facilities. They basically, for the project, they outline, their science and what they intend to do, and then how they need the computer resources, and generally an overview of how they'll use the resources, and an outline generally of the amount of compute power that they need. 50% of the projects apply some form of AI, machine learning, or combination of high performance computing with AI and machine learning. Most of the PIs in the initial list are US based. We do have one each from Nepal, one from Porto, and one from India. We are offering technical support to each of the teams. it did not intend this to be, a marketing slide. I can go over some of the things we've done so far and are doing, but in general, our approach is to reach out to each of the PIs, understand both what their science objectives are and how they're using the computer systems. I didn't list it here. I think over 60 to 70% of the project teams use our GPUs, our platform, in one way or another. And it's been our experience that in many cases there are things that they would like the platform to be able to do that it may not, either the platform doesn't do or the application stack doesn't do. And we are working where we have relationships with the developers to make enhancements as are being requested by some of the teams. As an example, one of the initial projects, which I'll talk about, was using AutoDock, which did not have a GPU feature, and we were able to add that in so that it could be run on GPUs and run at scale. And I think that kind of call it a beta release it's in final test. I think the final test is being done at Oak Ridge right now. We're also taking a couple of the applications that are generally optimized for either one or a small number of GPUs, and we're working with the developer teams to either build out new libraries or work to build out the application so it can run at a larger scale. I'll pause here. Are there questions about the overall consortium and how it works that I can try to answer? So let's see with this hand raising thing here. Okay. We'll assume that's a no.
I think, just to be clear, I think in the same bucket, there is, of course, also the Open Science Grid is plugged into this. Is that correct?
If they're not an official consortium member, they'd be a de facto consortium member because most of these sites are linked with the Open Science Grid. The reason I can't say that for sure, Peter, is I personally don't know how the Open Science Grid is linked to the cloud, but I imagine it is. So.
Well, I know that they are part of this consortium. They're listed on the front page of the website for the consortium.
That's true. They are a member.
Great. In the teams that we've engaged with, they haven't mentioned that that they were using the Open Science Grid. Basically, what I listed here, I probably should have said this is not primary sites. These are the sites, as we've engaged with the teams, these are the sites that the people are using. Now, that doesn't mean they're not using the Open Science Grid. They just hadn't mentioned it to us as part of the assets that they were using. And that may be that they're going to use the Open Science Grid resources, later in the project as well. That's a good catch. Thanks, Peter. I mean, this it's kind of a working deck. I probably should have listed this as draft. Other comments, questions?
Yeah, Tom, they're listed they're listed actually under federal agencies on the page. They're a subset of the National Science Foundation on the breakdown of the consortium members.
Okay. Yeah. And what I was thinking of when I would listed the sites, it was places where people would go to do computing.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And then, also the way a lot of these teams are working, they may have their own local assets as well that they use maybe to stage things, and then they would go actually run the bigger jobs here. So there's, there are tentacles of this that go out into other resources as well. Good. Other comments, questions on this? We can come back to it as well. What I want to do now is just kind of briefly go through some of these 37 projects, because I had been talking to Mike about that. And then what we'll do, there are a couple of these projects, largely because they're using novel methods that I thought would be interesting to kind of go through. Some of the teams, and let's go down to this then. Okay. So there's a couple of slides here with the list of, just put this down, okay. With the list of the various projects. So you may recognize some of these names. What you'll see is some of them are using, density functional binding calculations, which would be the first one, Brian Wong from UC Riverside. As you kind of look down the list, you'll start to see some of these folks are using simply conventional methods. And what I would say when I say conventional methods, I'm talking about direct numerical simulation. Others are using artificial intelligence-driven biology. I've got a slide kind of at the high level that describes what they're doing, and there may be some questions there. And Abe and I can kind of dig into that. Others are purely using AI. Most of the software from a application perspective, kind of conventional modeling software, almost all of it is molecular dynamics. I guess there's a small amount of chemistry, but I think in general, most of the projects that are using conventional methods are using molecular dynamics, and the codes that they're generally using are Amber, GROMACS, and NAMD. You'll see some QMMM, and I may pick up a couple of more, but there's what's interesting, I think, it kind of tracks our observation of the supercomputing market. There might be a few hundred molecular dynamics applications that are used, but when it comes to kind of there are typically a couple that are used most often, and that's definitely the case here. There are a few outliers. I think Tinker, which is based in Europe, is a molecular dynamics simulation that is kind of outside of that Amber, NAMD, GROMACS, kind of the top three. I've got a slide on the rest of these. Let me, as I move from this slide, Abe, is there any comment you would want to make about any of the projects here? I've got a deep dive into some of these later. If there's just an overall comment you want to make.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, overall, I think every one of these obviously is trying to fight COVID-19, trying to understand the CoV-2 virus in some way. And so the way I would characterize it, of course, like from the biological perspective, you have the virus and the capsid and the proteins, and the virus attaches to human host cells via this ACE2 receptor, and then obviously injects the viral DNA or RNA, and that's how the cell gets the viral proteins get replicated and does all the damage. So all of these projects, I think, try to do one of two things. They try to either understand the protein structure and function through looking at the viral proteins, looking at how the virus binds to the human host protein via the membrane and membrane receptor. So looking at that binding interface between those proteins, or looking at how potential drugs affect viral proteins, the binding of the virus to the human proteins, or inhibiting, in some way blocking that the binding mechanism. So overall, there are kind of two. There's just sort of a pipeline of approaches that are being used. Molecular dynamics, certainly to look at structure and dynamics of the proteins, and that sort of dovetails into how people look at how small molecules interact with the proteins, like on a smaller scale. So moving from kind of large scale simulations where you're trying to model the full viral capsid in all its glory and binding to the human host cells, you're going to be using large scale methods, big molecular dynamics simulation, coarse grained force field, hundreds of millions of atoms, down to taking a small, kind of zooming in on some of the smaller structure and functionality, looking at how small molecules bind to individual proteins, starts to get into some of the medium-sized molecular dynamics, and dovetailing into looking at like a detailed energetics of the small molecule binding to the proteins. So now you're talking about things like small molecule docking, and then of course exploring chemical space, trying to identify which potential molecules you should be looking at. And that gets into kind of cutting edge AI methods, where generative methods for generating target molecules with targeted properties, like in this case, binding energies, and docking, screening, scoring methods. So hopefully that kind of overview gives you a sense of the types of methods being used. And I would say largely every one of these projects you could kind of fit into one of those methods along the pipipeline, like I've described.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah,
Tom,
thanks.
so can I ask a question? There's sort of order a dozen.
Well, there's actually 2 more slides.
So you have more. What I was going to say is this is a surprisingly small number, given the reorientation of the there we go, the research community at large towards solving this sort of major societal problem.
Well, as I said, there's 37 projects that have been vetted and approved so far. More are coming in. I don't think this spans the set of all work going on computer modeling, but these are teams that didn't have computer time on one of these systems already and needed additional, or they had time but they didn't have enough. So this isn't the sum total of work in the science community going on against this. This is the sum total of work of people that requested access to these facilities in the last couple of weeks.
Got it. Okay.
In fact, I'm glad you asked that, Peter, because I did want to point that out. This is, in fact, I'm going to mention one of the projects that we're actually working with is kind of tied in. Some of these projects are also we refer to them as super projects. So some of, unless I pointed out, I'd say the overwhelming majority of these focus on exactly the problem that's kind of listed in the, this is a summary here in the project list. A couple of them actually are contemplating either all of or a big part of the entire discovery pipeline. So a couple of these projects actually go from drug screening to epidemiology. All but then there's a couple that do that. Otherwise, these are fairly focused within, if you want to think of it as a silo, or but that's bounded in terms of the focus that they have. So this is page 1. This is page 2. And I'll just skip to page 3 so you can kind of see. This is the full list of projects that have requested time. These are actually in the order that we received them from the approval site, so from the approval committee. So as these come into they're approved, we bring them in-house to NVIDIA, we review them, and then we reach out to the teams. Some of the teams are well on their way and don't need any help. Some of the teams we're engaged with, and I'll talk about some of the things they're doing that's a little bit unique. I'm building on what Abe, in fact, let me just build on what Abe said. A lot of the molecular dynamics work that is typically done on with computers is generally not much larger than about 500,000 atoms, and generally doesn't go much longer than a few nanoseconds. And what we're seeing is, in this picture here, is kind of the evolution of HPC systems. Where most people are today is about typically, 500,000 to 1 million atoms in about a few nanoseconds. The problems that some of the teams are looking at trying to get to with their project is 200 million atoms over a few microseconds. And it's an observation I'll make that I think the community in general across all domains has kind of, as they've run into this barrier, this is the Moore's Law, one of the many Moore's Law charts, and I kind of listed on here the different computer systems. I think there's been a big challenge in moving a lot of the scientific modeling codes so that they really can go all the way, oops, let me go back here. Oops, what are we doing? Sorry about that. All the way up where we want to go here. To model 200 million atoms over a couple of microseconds, that's what we really need to have clinically relevant models. And I think if there's a positive outcome from COVID-19 is, at least within this community, it's kind of created its own natural grand challenge problem. So it's kind of the community's having to think about solving problems that they haven't in their research that they generally have been doing, had to focus on. And I think the HighEnergy Physics community has their own grand challenge problem, which is high luminosity LHC. And I think that's good for the community. I think the community needs a grand challenge problem. I wish there was one that wasn't actually killing people and causing such economic devastation as this one, because this has been awful. But it is a problem that requires, you know, extreme modeling beyond that, which I think people had been doing. So I think it is causing, I think from a modeling perspective, I think there'll be, you know, a positive residual outcome. And the reason I show these machines here on the slide is, in my own experience, the community went through quite a bit of angst moving from the Cray era to the ASCII red and the petascale era. And I think one of the reasons that they were able to make that move was it was pretty clear the methods and the codes that were running on the Cray probably weren't going to be able to solve the grand challenges of that era, which would have been, you know, one of them would have been to solve, you know, map the human genome. I think one of the other problems was actually to find Higgs boson. And I think some of the changes that were made to use, like the Open Science Grid as an example, that kind of came out of this era. A lot of the reasons that people did all that hard work was to address a grand challenge problem. And I think this COVID-19 has created one of those for us. And I hope we can address it. I'm going to shift here now to some of the projects that are combining AI and conventional models. It kind of builds on that slide and some of the challenges that the teams have that are using the supercomputing assets. So what's shown on this slide, this is actually a slide that I took from Abe, so I may hand it to him when I'm done kind of briefing the high level. Essentially what's shown on the x-axis is the order of compute cost. So classical force fields, you know, it's O to the N. The DFT calculation that's generally done in some of the more advanced molecular dynamics and the quantum chemistry codes, Hartree-Fock, that's HF, cost about n cubed. So if I double the fidelity of my model, I've got to pay, you know, 8 times the compute cost. The most highly accurate model is CCSDT, and that's closely coupled single, double, triple. And the compute cost there goes up by end of the 7th. And kind of the yin and yang with computer modeling is, if I want to make the model at a high degree of fidelity, my compute cost goes up so fast that you generally have to then reduce the order of the model to be able to get to run enough fidelity of the model. You've got to reduce the fidelity of the method. And what the integration of AI and ML methods to be more closely coupled with these is to essentially extend the reach accuracy, so we can get the accuracy that you would otherwise get with a high fidelity model, but the size of the model you'd only otherwise be able to address with classical force field type modeling. And we've got some of the examples there. Abe, are there some comments you would like to make to kind of build on this? Is your slide?
Yeah, absolutely. Just, summarizing exactly what you said, and stepping back, MD is, at the heart of it, is really computing the interaction energy, right? You compute the interaction energy between two atoms and all the atoms in the system, and then you integrate Newton's equations of motion to move the trajectory along, and that's how you sample. So it comes down to how you compute that interaction energy. So at the two extremes, you've got the classical force fields, which have a simple empirical description of the interaction energy. And what you get is a low computational cost. So they're cheap, they're easy to compute, but you lose the ability to model the electrons rearranging, right? So bond breaking, bond reformation, you can't describe that. Really detailed interactions that depend on electron densities, you're not capturing changes in the electron density. On the other hand, at post-Hartree-Fock methods like CCSDT, you get all the electronic structure, but at an extremely high computational cost. So what you want, and the promise of machine learned potentials, are potentially a quantum accurate description of that interaction energy, but at the computational complexity of a classical force field. And I forgot to mention kind of the overview of a lot of these projects. One of the most exciting things is we're starting to see these machine learned potentials be integrated into the molecular dynamics codes.
Questions about any of this before we move on? Drilling into this, these are a couple of the examples, Abe, of the projects. So as we go into some of these details, one thing I think this community would be interested in, Abe, in what data size generally results from one of these models? Are we talking, terabytes, petabytes, exabytes?
Yeah, many terabytes. These are systems of hundreds of millions of atoms, anywhere from 2 million atoms to 200 million atoms, and simulated over time scales anywhere from, microseconds to, for some of the smaller systems, they can get out to, they're trying to get out to even milliseconds. So this is terabytes of data. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one of the things, and I'll talk about it in a future, the next slide, I think, is I think there's an opportunity for us to think about how the data gets shared between the stages of the pipeline. Some of the projects that actually comprehend that, when we ask them a question, how are they going to share the data between the different phases? It's kind of an open, an open question, and I think this is an area where Peter, the HEP community, may be able to weigh in and provide some guidance. Let me just run through a couple of these projects. Just this is what I talked to Mike about the other day. So Jeremy Smith at Oak Ridge, he's using Summit. Essentially, he's using a full in silico method with and in vitro. So he's going to couple this all the way into the lab. He's using Autodoc along with GROMACS, which is a molecular dynamics tool that actually I think is built in your home area, Peter. I think it's the home base of GROMACS is Amsterdam. We're pretty excited about this one because just the general method is pretty interesting scientifically. One of the things they needed to do is be able to run Autodoc at much larger scale. So we've actually gone in, and this is the code where we've optimized the Autodoc code with GPUs, and that's being tested right now, actually this week at Oak Ridge, to be able to run at scale. The next project is actually what we would refer to just internally kind of as a super project because it comprehends multiple areas of the pipeline. This is actually, as listed here, just one of the projects within the overall scope. Actually, the project at the bottom is tied into this one. What they want to do is they want to steer, they want to use AI to steer Amber and then link that up with AutoDoc. So essentially here they want to use AI to select which runs of Amber they want to run, and then based on that, then they'll use AutoDoc to kind of close the loop at this phase of the pipeline. This personally to me is one of the more exciting projects I've engaged with, just because of the scope of what they're trying to do and the fact that they're implementing some of these new methods. The specific science is outside of my field too far, so I'm going to hand it over to Abe. You want to kind of dig into maybe a little bit of what's going on in the key points here?
Sure. And in that supergroup collaboration, essentially, I'll repeat a lot of what this may sound familiar from what I talked about in the overview, but this supergroup has, I think, 7 PIs on the proposal, all, scientists, independent scientists in their own right. And they are tackling the complete end-to-end pipeline, more or less, of what I've described. So starting from the zoomed out view of the full viral capsid, binding to the human host cell, looking at that binding mechanism and how the changes to the membrane occur and membrane fusion, down to at the smaller scale, looking at individual viral proteins and how different ligands interact with and may inhibit the individual proteins, to another PI in the same group is using generative methods to generate potential drugs to look at, to do the docking calculations, and then in a separate section of the proposal, screening through these millions of compounds. And they all kind of work together in sort of a synergistic loop, you can imagine, right? So knowledge of how the individual proteins behave from these big simulations can inform the different ligands you might consider, because perhaps evident from the simulations are new potential binding sites that maybe were previously not noticed. So you identify new binding sites, that leads to new docking calculations and a whole new set of molecules that you might be considering as potential drugs. While back to all the other proposals, many of the other proposals, ambitious in and of themselves, only tackle a piece of this, whereas this particular proposal is proposing to do the entire pipeline end to end. So it's an exciting one for sure.
Yeah, there's one other epidemiology, I think, that's standalone, but this one actually includes epidemiology in the mix as well, which is pretty intriguing. One of the big challenges there is with the epidemiology. If you've been following all the debate in the public eye of the folks here in the state of Washington, up at University of Washington, IHME, and their projections, one of the challenges that whole community has is really understanding how the contagion works. And one of the outgrowths of this project is actually trying to, have a low-level model of how it works and feed that into an agent-based simulation that would be driven by active learning. We're definitely a ways from that, because they need the upstream part of this process to finish first. The next project is one we've actually been working with at NVIDIA for some time. It's University of Florida, CMU, and a number of other organizations. Torch Annie is a neural net that was developed at the University of Florida specifically to represent it would be a neural net that replaces a reduced order model, or actually even a higher order model from molecular dynamics. It's Anakin ME is what the full name of it is. I think this work was done probably back in 2016. It's evolved significantly over the last couple of years. They're using and the Torch Annie is the updated version of it with PyTorch. That's what that all stands for. And they're using it in conjunction with Amber today to create a library of screen candidates. So they're using the Torch Annie tool rapidly go through multiple candidates, and then they run Amber to get a finer view of what each of those candidates might look like, and then they use RDKit and OpenEye and I think some other tools to then further refine that list. And their objective here would be a library here in the next couple of months, I think. Ultimately, what they want to do is be able to embed Torch Annie with Amber, so they get this kind of super app. But that's a future goal, as I understand it from the team. The next project on the list that we kind of combines these is using a variational autoencoder with NAMD and scikit. So at some levels, Peter, this is kind of very similar to some of the work that that you had reviewed as part of IRIS-HEP. All right, where we're kind of taking some conventional methods and using them in conjunction with scikit, and so you get to leverage all the work that's gone on under scikit there. This group has actually taken a model that they had developed at small scale and then trying to scale it up on both the NAMD and the variational autoencoder. And then I'll just kind of go down to jump to the bottom. Romy Amaro, she's actually not this project is not through the consortium, but she's part of Arvind's group. And I put that on here because the scale of the molecular dynamics simulation that she wants to consider is significantly bigger than what is commonly done. In fact, the project above it is actually bigger than is commonly done. Dr. Chang from UC Riverside is currently, running sims at about 500,000 atoms for a microsecond, which is, typically if they run a model that big, it's run only for a few nanoseconds, maybe 100 at most. And to be able to do that over microseconds, that simulation time, the wall clock time for that sim is 10 days on GPUs. And the GPU code there has been sped up significantly. To run that on a CPU-based system would take over a year. So to put this project below it in context, they want to look at 2 million atoms, 200 million atoms. Oops, yeah, 200 million atoms. They're currently running at 2 million. I didn't do the computation there, but they were able to run 65 nanoseconds a day. So those 2 million atom runs, they take a long time. If you can do the calculator on that, it's got to be a week or more. Their goal is 200 million atoms.
So we had Tom, Romy was kind enough to come and talk to us about 2 weeks ago. Just a few minutes ago uploaded the video from her presentation. Yeah, super exciting.
It is, and if there's science that's going to have to be done to get a model at that scale to be accurate, that's way beyond my domain understanding. But I can just envision, if your common model is 2 million and you're going to go to 200 million, you're considering a lot more physics, and the compute is significant as well, to think of the scope of what we're doing is for this grand challenge problem, you take the work that Romy is doing, that's part of the project that Arvind is running. So all of this kind of comes together. If you think about the scale of what they're trying to do, it's just significantly bigger than the type of scientific research in this domain that was going on 6 to 8 weeks ago. Any questions about any of these look interesting? And maybe if after the fact, Peter, people have looked through this and said, hey, we either know Alexander or Isiev, or boy, that looks interesting. We could certainly, particularly on this list, we have kind of ongoing discussions with each of these teams. some of the ones on the, on the broader list, we have at least some outreach. So if these look interesting or you think you might be able to, help out or something, we'd be happy to, broker the introduction if you don't already know the folks.
So absolutely, Tom, that's, the purpose of this forum and what we've been trying to do. You've watched HighEnergy Physics in action, so you sort of understand the strengths and weaknesses of the sort of, wide scale collaborations we have and the data intensive science we do and distributed computing and so on. So, absolutely, we're looking for places where we can potentially contribute, right? And I think you're kind of a key person who has kind of a sense of, who we are and, what they're trying to do. And there's a sociological part, there's a technical part, and then there's, and you understand very clearly the range of things. That's probably where you're going next. So I pass it back to you.
Yeah. So at the high level, kind of go back and forth. So if we take the projects here and take them to the simplest possible high level where I understand these things. On the one side, you've got, MD conventional modeling that's now being moved to go at scale. So if there's, you all have experience taking your own conventional models and trying to get them to run at scale, and you think you might have something to, add there, you could certainly talk to us, because we have, not me personally, but folks like Abe and we have technical experts at NVIDIA that have helped optimize each of these codes. So, NAMD, Amber, GROMACS, to a lesser extent, it's kind of OpenMM, some of the others, but those three for sure, we have people at in NVIDIA that have worked on those codes for at least 4 to 5 years, in some cases a decade. But we're open for great ideas, and many of those codes have been optimized to run at 1 million atoms for 100 nanoseconds, and now we're talking a few 100 million atoms for a few microseconds. So the level of scale is big. So if you have things that you think would be interested there, we're certainly keen there. On the AI ML modeling side, frankly, my observation is the research folks we have at NVIDIA that focus on AI ML for like image processing, self-driving cars, natural language processing. We have research teams that are inside the company that focus on that. They may actually be ahead of the application of those into science. So one of the things we've made those people available. We haven't yet, although we will probably starting this week, start to engage them with some of these teams. But if you got, I know, I'm aware of some of the work that the folks over, I think of them as being based in Geneva, but some of them are actually based at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. Anyways, that work in your community where you've been doing, graph neural nets and some of that for the particle physics, there could certainly be some interesting synergies there, particularly as new as AI ML is. I mean, in the application of science, I mean, this is so brand new. Mike Sokolov and I were teasing each other. I'd say, I wrote my first program in 1979, and Mike said he had me beat by 10 years. I'm like, oh, all right. So I said, I've been doing this for a long time. Yeah, AI ML is exciting because for the most part, it's pretty much brand new in the last, as its application to science. I mean, I wrote my first AI program back in 1984, but that was like before the first nuclear winter of AI. So the stuff they're doing now is just, off the charts. But if you guys have some things there, that would be interesting. I drew this little bubble at the bottom for the question mark. This community generally doesn't do a lot of sharing. A lot of these high-end research projects get tied in with industry. And so by design, a lot of the data is siloed. They've agreed to share their data. The COVID-19 projects have all agreed to share their data. So there may be an opportunity for some of the things that you guys have done in the HEP community for years. We were talking to the folks at Mulsey and think it was Levi there had mentioned that you guys are already talking to them. So if, you've already got that going, but if, there's anything we could do there, that's clearly making the discovery pipeline run better.
Yeah, no, there's absolutely some interesting things going on. So there was a last Friday, there was an NIH organized seminar about, general open data repositories, which included, of course, Zenodo, which is the one out of CERN, but also Mendeley, which is, and the Harvard Dataverse and so on. But yeah, again, it's a sociological aspect of the community, which is, what community structure they have for these things. So actually, Romy was one of the people that organized, Romy Amaro, UCSD, who was part of organizing the sort of community letter about the open data sharing there. And tying together the computational part with the data sharing and data flow aspects and the larger workflows is, something that, we have a lot of experience doing in the particle physics community, because we have this community structure. So that's, absolutely a place, if we can help people develop these things, we're looking for places. So
that to me seems ripe, Peter. And I think we're taking the long view on this. I think this is a grand challenge problem. Hopefully, I saw a report that some people think they may get a vaccine in 6 months. Boy, I hope so. Regardless, I think this effort, I think, is showing us where the gaps are, both in our modeling capability and data sharing. And I could be hopeful, but I doubt that this, we're not going to have a COVID-20 something before we're all done here. And so kind of getting some of these gaps in the discovery pipeline so that they could go faster when we're confronted with another one of these, so that maybe by the time it starts to get contagious, we actually have drugs ready. That would be just so fantastic. So I think these discussions are worth having, even if we can't affect COVID-19. I think we can do better for what comes next. And I'll kind of lose this. In the communities understands this. So I pulled this picture out of the big data report, which is a few years old now. But I think we probably should think about moving from tying together the in vitro and in silico modeling, and where we've got gaps in the data. So, tying this all the way back into the lab. Today, these two, I think the high energy physics community is much closer to coupling what you guys do with the experiment and what you do with simulation. And I think this community could probably benefit from that. I think we'd all benefit. So I think this, focusing on this is a good problem to focus on. And we can use this, as horrible as the whole COVID thing is, I think we can use it as a grand challenge problem to try to iron some of these issues out. And I think this is kind of my last picture. Is I think we have methods that we know really work, right? We can build wooden ships with sails, and it's really great. And I think we're starting to see that, if we put some of these things together, we actually could achieve a moonshot. And it's been exciting to watch. And to the extent, Peter, we can help facilitate with your community, we're happy to. And that's my last slide. So we're just about out of time as well. So.
A quick question, Tom. This is Mike. Your focus today has obviously been the U.S. consortium, but I assume that this similar type of work is being done in Europe, Asia, wherever. Do you have a one sentence summary of what else is being done, and is NVIDIA engaging with the European efforts and things like that similarly?
We have relationships with each of the sites where we have GPUs in Europe. And I don't believe they have an effort that's as organized as the consortium is here. So we're assisting on point projects. We would certainly do the same thing in either of the other geographies that we're doing in the U.S. We have resources to do that. We have not seen the level of traction that we have in the U.S. today, but I would expect. I've seen mention that the EU was going to tee up, their version of a similar type of consortium effort, but I haven't seen that has traction. Some of the folks on the line may actually be closer to some of that than I am. Okay, evidently not. But we are working individually with some teams in Europe. In fact, Ian, who I know is on the line, I mean, we've connected the folks at Simon's Foundation with that team that's at TU Munich. They're doing protein folding using natural language processing as well as LSTM type methods, and they're actually probably going to do some more work in that area. So there are definitely teams in Europe that I'm personally aware of that we're working with. I don't know if we're doing anything in Asia, but I would imagine our team over there probably is. I just haven't connected it. That's a good question. Other questions?
Well, I've got several more, but so do you understand how software like Autodoc or GROMACS or Amber is sustained, and how the community is trained, and how welcome people outside the core groups are to contribute, use, whatever? Like, how much are these really community codes, and how much are these bespoke?
They're community. Those actually all the three main codes that are being used, and I'm familiar with those. Other ones that we're not as familiar with, I don't know about the community, but I'm going to assume they kind of are run the same way. There's typically a core team of developers that kind of leaders, and then it is very much a community effort. They're vetted, tested, and then they have a release process. We have NVIDIANs actually, you can almost think of his work as part of those teams. GROMACS, as an example, had a version, their most recent version is GROMACS 20. It was for 2020. We contributed quite a bit of optimization there. That gets all vetted and released. So it's a very well, I'd say for those codes that we're aware of, it's a very well organized process. And the standard release generally includes the optimization. So, it's fairly relatively straightforward to get the version of the code and then be able to take advantage of the optimizations. Abe, do you have any comments you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think, the codes you're probably referring to, like GROMACS, Amber, NAMD, are university-led primarily codes, open source, and development teams within the universities. So I imagine that, anybody who wanted to contribute code, I'm sure they would engage in conversations with that. So I would think that they would be open. At least the initial conversations.
Yeah, and we could facilitate that because we're pretty well connected with those teams, for sure. Autodoc is a little different, though. I think some of those docking codes are actually ISV codes, I think.
Correct.
What does ISV mean?
Commercial. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Vendor speak. Yeah, it's a commercial code as opposed to open source.
Thanks.
So Tom, I think one thing, and I think it would be GROMACS, for example. I think it would be interesting for us if we can make some contacts just with the people developing these codes. I mean, these things are pretty mature. Mm-hmm. So it's probably not so much about the codes themselves as about the strategies for using them. But yeah, if we can make some contacts just to get a better sense of what they're doing and where they're going.
Sure. If you would like, Peter, I have a colleague, his name is Jonathan Leffman. He's actually, his full-time job is to engage with those community each of those developer communities. So we could I could just set up a call for you, or Jonathan might be, if I could get some time on his calendar, be willing to come in and brief, do the similar thing here and talk more in detail about that, or we could bring in, you know, Tom Cheatham or Adrian Reutberg from the Amber Consortium. I personally don't know the folks who work on GROMACS, but NVIDIANs do, or John Stone and Jim Phillips who work on NAMD. So we're, you know, we could I'd leave that as open. It depends on how you guys want to engage. I mean, we have, you know, regular contact with each of those development teams.
So we have the perspective that this is not something that's going to resolve itself in the next month. So you know, it's a year and a half process. So let's follow up separately to see
Sure.
if we can engage. Okay, are there questions or comments for Tom? Thanks, Tom. This was great.
Yeah, just one especially related to optimization. Since you mentioned the graph neural networks for tracking and calorimetry and stuff, one thing that I've definitely noticed there working on that is that while things are reasonably speedy enough, it could very, very clearly use a keen eye from someone who's optimized or well code similar to it before, working on graph algorithms and whatnot. Like a lot of the stuff in Torch Geometric, for instance, definitely has some like memory access pattern problems that could be dealt with and optimized. And there's a few clustering algorithms within it as well when you get to the intersection of graph neural networks and unsupervised learning and stuff like that, that have absolutely abysmal volatile GPU usage that really need a close look, and that open source community could really benefit from it.
So comment on that. I was on a thread this morning about that exact topic. And we're kind of looking at where graph neural networks are being used. Obviously, they're being used all over in chemistry. It's super interesting to hear that they're being used for tracking and calorimetry. And it's hilarious because I use Torch Geometric for the applications in chemistry, and you just mentioned that. So it's, I don't know, I'm going to take that feedback, and maybe even we can connect offline and talk more about graph neural networks for high energy physics.
Yeah, I didn't recognize that voice. I apologize. Normally, I'm pretty good at that.
Oh, hi, I'm Lindsay Gray. I'm a scientist at Fermilab.
Hi, Lindsay. I don't know that we've met before, but yeah.
I don't think we've met in person before.
Yeah.
I will link you up, Tom.
Great.
Okay.
No, we'd be happy to. Obviously, that's we'd be keen to dig into that. That's exactly the kind of thing we're looking for. And the good news is that since you can use it in calorimetry, I can get engineering resources to focus on it pretty quickly because they need it for chemistry right now.
Right. And I mean, along those lines as well, there are some networks that we've played around with that I've actually taken from high energy physics to use them on a chemistry benchmark data set, and the performance was pretty good. So there's obvious cross-pollination routes here, and we should just talk.
There's no doubt. I've one of the teams I work with in astrophysics took a net that they trained to do LIGO detection and applied it to galaxy detection, and it worked just great.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's definitely cross-pollination opportunities there. That's kind of when I go back to this slide. You know, if you've got things that you're doing in graph neural nets, we should just go talk. And then number one, things that you might need sped up, we can focus on those. And then if there's things that, you know, Abe, you might be interested to see what they've done on the HEP side for tracking, a lot of that might be reusable.
Absolutely. Yeah, can't wait to learn more about that.
Perfect.
Yeah, let's figure out a time to chat. Thanks.
Absolutely. This is our number one priority. So we'll use it as an opportunity to engage.
Okay, cool. I will link that up. Other questions, comments, ideas? Raise your hand or slowly jump in.
Back to that. Well, great, and you know, and Peter, you know where to find me. So if the team, if the group here would like to either number one dig into some of the codes, we could do that. And if there are some other topics that kind of relate to this, you know, just engage with me, and we can link you up with the people at NVIDIA or people in the community that you may not already have contact with.
Absolutely. You know, like we said, this thing is not going to go away in the next 2 weeks. So it's a conversation, and we'll keep it open. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you, Abe. Also, this has been great. We'll follow up. Thank you very much.
Great. Sounds wonderful. Thanks, guys.